find my panelists. In the meantime, can you all please put the speaker order in the chat? Thank you, OG and CEO, for already doing that.
I want to know if the round is started.
Sorry, what? I'm just waiting for the confirmation from the CA that I can continue without the panelists in case they don't join. Sorry to keep you waiting. Okay, we're starting without the panelist. So hi everyone, my name is Anna. I'll be your chair for today. And since everyone is here and everyone texted their speaker order, I think we can start the round. Just please refer to me as chair. No need to use pronouns. With that in mind, I am inviting Prime Minister to open up this debate. Before you start your speech, you're you're welcome to state your preferred pronouns and your POY preferences if you have any. Thank you, everyone, and let's have a great round.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Can I have POIs in chat, please? Specifically in text space 4, thank you. Beginning in 3, 2, 1, go. Chair, we have reached a point of no return, a point where climate change is inevitable and global warming is likely to get even worse into the future. That is to say that OP can't come up and say that their side or our side can reverse the effects of climate change. Therefore, the necessity of the hour is to have a stopgap in place to both protect current generations and to minimize the effect that we have on future generations when it comes to this. Three things then. One, on framing and trying to preempt anything that OP says about like bad incentives. Two, we're going to talk about how this is the only mechanism by which you can actually do anything. And three, we're going to talk about how this betters the climate change movement. Actually, four things. Four, we're going to talk about the principal obligation and how this is principally good. One, on framing, I think opposition is going to say stuff like corporations are going to do this, this is going to be bad. I think this is untrue and this is likely to be done by two broad actors. I think one, this is likely to be done by good natured, environmentally leading corporations like, I don't know, Greenpeace, and two, this is likely to be done by governments in general. Why? First segment of this, four reasons. I think one, because of the high access of capital that you need to do this in the first place. At the point at which companies likely have limited resources, they're likely to not want to do this in the first place. Two, on a note that crucially you need access to patents to do this, but most of these patents are held by these good nature organizations in the first place. You're unlikely to have like a corporation like, I don't know, Shell do this in the first place. Three, because of the differing natures of incentive structures, I'm unsure as to why an oil company or like a company with bad incentives wants to do this in the first place. Four, because of how research and development within these sectors are likely to have a high barrier of access in the first place. And five, because the technology that is existent is really specific. At the point at which all of this exists, this is likely to be only done by a few select number of corporations with good incentives in the first place. But two, I want to note that governments are likely to do this because there's likely to be some form of global widespread support for this. One, because this is the reason this motion exists in the first place. Two, because of the fact that governments want to satisfy large voter blocks and because of the fact that they have left-wing pockets within countries. Three, because of the increasing strength of the climate change movement in the first place. And four, because of precedent, both domestically and internationally through the Paris treaties and like the Kyoto Agreement of the 1990s. As a result of this is likely to be done either one, pretty well in the first place, or two, by, even if it's not well done, it's likely to be done by organizations that want to do it well. This likely preempts anything that Op wants to talk about with regards to how this is likely to be done badly. The second thing they're going to come up and say is that this is likely to be harmful or unpredictable. I think one, this probably falls to all of the stuff that I just talked about, but two, this is likely to be fairly tested and regulated by like a large body of scientists. This is likely to be peer reviewed in the first place. I don't think they can get away with saying this. First argument then on how this is a point of no return and how this is the only mechanism by which you can change things. On a no crucially that climate change is necessarily irreversible. A few reasons for this. I think one, because of just general scientific evidence that the global average voter probably has access to and has probably heard of. Two, because of the entrenched nature of capitalism. A, because of the fact that this is the entrenched, inevitable economic structure that exists in society. Two, because you lack support for pure socialist regimes in society. Three, because of the existence of right-wing pockets that are unlikely to want to budge and are strictly pro-capitalist in the status quo. And four, because of the monopolization of corporations, both on the preferences of individuals, but also on general society itself. What all of this means is that capitalist practices are still likely to exist. As a result of this, you're still likely to get some form of harm to the environment in the first place. But I think thirdly, you probably have the fact that a lot of the harm has already been done means that a lot of the scientific reaction of like global warming and shit like that has already happened so far, and is likely to continue to accumulate into the future. As a result, this is the only mechanism by which you can actually accrue change, because there's this necessary stopgap to like counterbalance against all of the shitty things that all of these corporations are doing right now, and two, are likely to do into the future. Not to say, I'll take the clarification from CEO. Go on then. POI from CEO.
Yeah, my clarification is very simple. So when you say that you are not reversing the effect, justify the whole idea of adding iron to increase algae in the ocean that was not already there.
Okay, so the reason why this is like the existing status quo is insufficient is because a lot of the regulation that exists in the status quo is necessarily pandering to these corporations in the first place through stuff like lobbying. This is the only mechanism by which you can actually like accrue a lot of the change that I talked about. This also falls to all of the stuff that I talked about earlier as to how the corporations that actually do this engineering are independent of the corporations that do all of this lobbying and all of the shitty things in the status quo. You're likely to get some of this change in the first place. But I think like as a result of all of this, this is the necessary stopgap that exists in place for you to necessarily do all of the like to allow these corporations to do all of these shitty things in the future. Second argument on how this betters the climate change movement. Note that this argument exists independent of whether this succeeds or not, and even if it fails, this is something that is true. I think one, because you legitimize the technology. As a result of legitimizing the technology, you probably are likely to get more people entering the market and like legitimizing that space within the market in the first place. As a result of this, you probably have an increase in competition between different players that exist in the market, and you have a crucial race to the bottom in terms of having like increasing the access to this technology or increasing like this technology's efficacy in the first place. What this means into the future is that this technology is only bound to improve. And I think this is specifically important in terms of whatever we prove with regards to how climate change is only going to get worse. As a result of climate change only going to get worse, and when we're able to better this technology, you probably have some form of counterbalance against anything that they say. But secondly, you likely get a trickle-down effect to the micro level. That is to say, when the climate change movement sees all of these good things doing stuff, they're likely to they're likely to incentivize members at the micro level to do all of these good things as well. But I think thirdly, your messaging as the climate change movement gets better. That is to say that a lot of criticism that exists against the status quo climate change movement is that it doesn't work in the first place. A lot of your regulation shitty things don't work. At the point at which you're artificially able to alter the status quo or alter a lot of these bad things, your messaging then becomes legitimized and you're able to bounce back against all of the bad criticism that you would have otherwise got on their side of the house. And finally, you probably get buy-in from fringe messaging groups, both on the left wing and the right wing, with regard to this. I think on the extreme left wing, they don't buy into the climate change movement because of all of the bad things that are happening with regards to the climate change movement. And on the right wing, they do all the criticism that I just talked about. You're likely to get more levels of buy-in, and it probably benefits the climate change movement as a whole. All of this exists as messaging in an optical signal that probably doesn't exist on that side of the house in the first place. But finally, I think this is principally good because A, you protect both the current generation in terms of how like you provide a stopgap, but two, you are able to future protect against a lot of the future generations that are likely to come up, or like you are able to do more like protection towards the future generations than anything that op can claim within this debate. I think in terms of weighing, this is specifically important in providing a stopgap because the current generation has some form of recourse, but future generations have no form of recourse. On their side of the house, the only thing that you're able to do, the only alternative that they have is some vague sense of like regulation and stuff like that doesn't do anything. As a result of all of the analysis that we tell you, the stopgap that we provide at least provides one extra barrier in terms of weighing. We clearly win this debate from side opening government. I beg you to propose.
Thank you so much for this fine speech. Let's move on to the first speech of opposition. Leader of opposition, the floor is yours. You're also free to specify your gender pronouns and your PY preferences if you want to.
Am I audible?
It's your.
Okay, sure. Thanks. Let me reduce the noise of the television set here. Okay, that's cool. So just keep the POIs in the text space. Just keep the POIs in the text space. Don't unmute within the speech. Prefer gender pronouns he, him. That's just about it. So, Chair, I will start in 3, 2, 1. One, I think there are a couple of things to note within this debate. One, I don't think there is an existence burden on any opposition side to prove a counterprop or to give you an alternative to this particular thing. Note that this is a belief motion that requires us to prove whether environmental movements should support this particular mechanism or not. What we just have to prove is why they shouldn't essentially support this particular thing. There is no burden on us to prove an alternative and all those sort of things. But let's talk about this second chart that is very important within this debate. One, we need to clearly analyze what is the objective of environmental movements, but also secondly, the mechanistic benefits they want to achieve, But notice that these mechanistic benefits are only important to like environmental movements when certain ethical considerations are always followed and obeyed within that particular cause. It means that movements in themselves have ethical considerations which they are not willing to depart from. At any point where a particular mechanism to solve a problem departs from that ethical consideration, it means that there is lesser likelihood for that movement to support that particular mechanism. What we need to prove is why this mechanism isn't in consonance with the sort of ethical considerations that like environmental movements do have at the end of the day. Let's go to the first piece of argumentation that you get from me. I think there is this I think one that we need to realize that we concede when OG says there is less probability for like corporations to do this. We think that it is countries in themselves that are the actor that are in the best position to like engage in this particular sort of like in this sort of mechanism. The problem then is that there is no universal like approach to using this mechanism. That is to say that countries individually in themselves would have to use this mechanism at the end of the day. The problem is that the technology in question, climate geoengineering or geoengineering in question already exists within status quo. But the problem is that the technology for the advancement of this of this sort of mechanism is only left to people who have the technology, but also secondly to people who have the access to resources to use this mechanism at the end of the day. The problem then is that for a vast majority of countries that exist within status quo, they don't have the resources to acquire this sort of technology and to use it at the end of the day. What is the principle then after this contextualization? It means then on their own side of the house, there is more likelihood that countries that would use like these particular things are countries that have access to the technology and all those sort of things. Notice here then that it means in the vast majority of instances, most countries and most demographics would be left out within this particular mechanism. It means then at the end of the day, there is more likelihood for some countries to have like better climate if we are assuming an utopian reality that this technology is going to work. This better climate, what this then essentially means is that it creates some sort of like classes disparity at the end of the day. It means that for a country like China, due to they have access to capital and resources and all these sort of things, that their climate will be comparatively better than neighboring countries like Hong Kong and all those sort of things. What this then extends or what this then means is that given the incentive of people to move to countries where climates are better off, it means that those countries that can establish like better like biosystems for themselves are more likely to like make themselves more richer from this particular mechanism and make like lesser countries like worse off at the end of the day due to they can't afford like the technology to use this particular sort of mechanism at the end of the day. How does this trickle down to the ethical considerations of like environmental movements at the end of the day? Environmental movement exists within status quo not to cater to not to support mechanisms that would always better like the situation of wealthier countries. They exist in order to ensure that climate change problems that exist, especially within places like Latin America and Africa that don't have access to capital, can do comparatively better. We think it is a stalemate on their own side if the benefits of everything that OG argues for is only going to happen for people that have access to capital and all those sort of things. But direct engagement to like OG, right? They make this assertion and say that all the benefits they talk of is not contingent on whether this works or not, but still goes on to talk of the mechanistic benefit of how the technology becomes more accessible. The problem is that a validation by like environmental movement doesn't automatically make these things more accessible or more like less costly at the end of the day. The reason why that assertion is true is because like the reason why things become comparatively like less expensive is due to like the mechanistics of demand and supply. If at the end of the day it is still going to be less in the hands of these capitalists at the end of the day, it means that it's lesser probability for like countries that exist within Africa or Latin America to be able to access this technology at the end of the day. It means then that all the benefits they talk of are how like there will be a race to the bottom and this will become like less costly and all those sort of things is less likely and never going to happen on their own side of the house. They need to prove mechanistically how that is true according to the laws of economics. But let's talk about the next principle. Okay, OG shoot, Rahman shoot.
Okay, so you're saying that countries don't have access to technology while the technology itself exists. So how do you are able to make these countries to be able to access these technologies on your paradigm?
Okay, I think this is something I noted earlier within the speech. We don't need to prove how like smaller countries need to have this access. The laws of economics already states that things become like only cheaper in the vast majority of instances if a lot more people are demanding for it, or there is like bailouts for this technology to become less like more accessible. The problem is that there is no incentive for capitalists to make these things like more accessible, given that they are more concerned about profits. You need to prove how that is more likely to happen at the end of the day in terms of like the economic like consideration. But let's talk about the next like bit of chat within this debate. I think one that seems to be like this subtle concession or this subtle fiat that like government wants to make, that this technology would work well in the vast majority of instances. We don't think that's always going to be the case, but let's assume in an utopian reality that's going to be the case. The problem is that climate change and like this mechanism will be used individually or would be used within a specific country. It means then that there is more likelihood for you to affect like the climatic like climatic like elements existing within another country at the end of the day. The reason why this is true is because of two mechanisms. What notice the interconnectiveness of like biosystems. The reason why there are different like food chains that interact like all over the world, but also secondly the idea of water and how tributaries and rivers all connected all over the world. It means that if a country like China decides to acidify like their water to make it like better for their populace, and this water flows down to Hong Kong and all those sort of things, what notice that you can't essentially prove that this is the sort of things that Hong Kong and their citizens do want at the end of the day. But secondly, is that you take like the unique considerations of your own country and end up like hampering like the climatic elements within other countries at the end of the day. The reason why this is problematic is because environmental movement exists to ensure that benefits are like exist for all people and across all board, and not uniquely for countries that do have access to capital. In a debate where like access to capital matters and all those sort of things, we think proud to oppose. Let me get this.
Thank you for this fine speech, and let's move on back to the government bench. DPM, whenever you're ready.
Okay, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, PY is in the chat. Please don't unmute yourself unless I ask you to. I'll be starting in a few seconds. Okay, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. I'll be doing two things. First of all, I'll be destroying Elo's mechanization or Elo's case, which was literally confusing because of the fact that they didn't really have anything to prove, like to give a counter prop or something like that. Let me remind you, this is not really a wood motion or likely a policy motion. We are trying to prove that why exactly it is justified, but not only that, how exactly it will work out if it is implemented. But secondarily, it is your burden was to prove that why exactly you will obviously have some kind of like access to it without any kind of repercussions or negative repercussions, because of you are like the. And secondarily, I'll be pulling some sort of pulling a few possible extension point to seal out the whole deal from the government side. So on that, firstly, on why opening opposition fails to prove it. they're trying to say that there are no universal mechanism to it. The problem with that is, if you are trying, my partner have already proved that why exactly it literally this kind it literally in his second argument is like why it makes a climate change messaging or climate change movement better, because of the fact that legitimizing newer technologies mean that there will be increased competition in order to improve the existing technology, meaning that you have a lot of room for more innovation, because of two things. Firstly, the climate change is irreversible. I'm not going to reiterate what my partner has said already said in his huge framing. But secondarily, the because of the fact that my partner have literally one half of one half of the debate by just framing, because it was really good. But secondarily, on the fact that technology that we have is not really enough, because of the fact that we as human beings are evolving. This generation, the technology and the living attitude of this generation will obviously change and shape shift on another generation, meaning that this kind of generational changing and shifting of behavior will obviously reflect on the life they are leading, and how exactly the nature and climate is getting affected, which is the reason why we can't just get stopped by the existing technology, but rather we obviously need a lot more innovation to ameliorate, or likely to innovate a much more better technology than what we have here, because of what we have right now. But secondarily, why exactly it is better? Because of the fact that when you increase innovation, it literally means that a lot of countries will obviously get access to it, because of the fact that a lot of companies are doing this kind of research and development on this field, meaning that we obviously are boxing the benefits that the opening opposition is trying to portray, that yeah, the mechanism of demand supply chain will obviously make things cheaper. That is not really just like, this is just a statement, but we exactly don't know how this works. So on that note, this is a kind of universal effort to in or with the country's own resource and own technology and their own barriers, makes it much more likely for this technology to be much more affordable and much more great in the future. Secondarily, they're talking about like this tech already exists. I've already talked about, yeah, it's for current generation, but in terms of when the generation changes, their lifestyle changes and the climate change changes according to it. So we need a much more innovation and much more better technology than what we have right now. Thirdly, they're talking about only people only people or country with access will get access to it, and countries will be left out, and richer country will be richer. I It doesn't really make sense, because firstly, these countries don't really have any kind of incentives to suck out the country with the technology. But secondarily, the climate is not only a singular or a single area of factor, but it also covers the whole world, meaning that you cannot really just pick and cherry pick a single country and just loot their loot or keep their things and stuff out with your technology, and there will be no recourse to it. My partner have already talked about why exactly we have a recourse plan, but I will obviously try to elaborate on that point, meaning that elaborate on that point. It means that these kind of things, when you're doing and liberating the technology and legitimizing the technology, meaning that this kind of climate engineering getting implanted not only on a singular place, but also it will obviously be used to cheapen it, because people's lives are at stake and we desperately need it, just like how COVID vaccine was literally distributed throughout the whole world for free, for that matter. So on that note, it literally went to the civilians. So on that note, this kind of a universal distribution is obviously possible if only we have this kind of sort of mechanism. Meaning that I have already practically impacted it a lot more deeper, which what the analysis my partner have given. So on that note, it becomes much more cheaper and affordable. But also, they're saying that only specified country will only be using it. Climate doesn't really include only a specific area or a country, but it also covers the whole world and the people within it. But before I move on, yeah, any kind of POI, any POI?
So your word at the end of the day hasn't proven or show how the underdeveloped countries and third world countries are going to have access to these things. And in a world where there is marginal distribution of goods and services as it relates to these climate change issues and all of those
Yeah.
problems. Engage.
The solution is that the increased competition to innovation means that a lot of companies will be innovating it, making it a lot more cheaper and accessible. But also, I've also analogized it with the COVID vaccine situation, meaning that it will obviously be accessible for countries which are in dire need. But secondarily, why exactly it is much more better? Because firstly, on the principal level, it is good because engineered stuffs are not really just thrown in the nature willy-nilly, but rather they're tested with how much they're implementable and whether or not they'll have a adverse effect on the nature. Meaning that if it have even a grain of a bad impact, then they will not be implemented. Meaning that the implementability and the sustainability is guaranteed, which is exactly the things that we need in this irreversible climate change action. But secondarily, it is insufficient and inefficient with what we exactly have right now because of the fact that all the things my partner have proven in his training. But thirdly, innovation and research and develop proficiency and efficiency will obviously be better for all the human being as a whole, and it is principally justified to use it because of the fact that the engineered stuffs go through justification and accountability checking before they're implemented, so which is the reason why is much more better which is better to implement it. So proud to propose.
Thank you so much for this fine speech, concluding OG. Let's go back to OO, DLO, whenever you're ready. The floor is yours.
Now, my audible chair.
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. Okay, the motion is already posted in the text. Don't badger, just type POI. I will take you. And starting in 3, 2, 1. At the end of the opening government's case, three things that can be viewed or seen from them is one, we want a world where there will be much development when it comes to, climate engineering system. We want a world where we improve engineering system that is going to better the universe and all of those things. But what they lack and what they don't understand in this debate is that one, climate or environmental movement stand primarily for three things. One, for inclusion, for advocacy, and for general recognition of all the countries of the world, irrespective of if you belong to the third world country, or if you are from Asia, or if you are from America, or you are from Africa. At a particular point where there is a move or there is a particular clamor for a certain things that is going to delegitimize the accessibility of other countries of the world from accessing this thing, that becomes the problem within this debate. We do concede to the fact that there is a need for us to care for the climate and why it is important for us to develop this. But the problem with this argument is that one, open government didn't primarily show you one, how they are going to breach those kind of diversity and interconnectivity that my members already told you about, in the sense that one, India can decide to acidify their seas. It works correctively well for them. What happens when this same sea flows into that of Africa? Is it going to still encourage or rather make it more durable for people within Africa to enjoy this type of thing? We also concede to the fact that there is a need for us to urgently care for the climate, but at the particular time where this kind of things are largely going to be harmful to all other members or countries of the world, it becomes disingenuous of opening government to assume that one, we to support those particular motive, because at that particular point you destroy every form of interconnectivity that exists between human beings and exists how people want to care about the climate and about the world they stay in. If you do not buy this argument panel, the second level becomes the level of access, the level of research and the level of resources to assess these things. They tell you one, we produce this engineering and ensure that individuals benefit from it. The question is then panel, if these technologies are sent to Africa, do Africa have the resources and the technological know-how for them to be able to achieve this? They do not prove or show to you one, any interconnectiveness, how these things are going to be achieved, or just because of the fact you send this climate engineering system to Africa? What about the resources that is going to be used to ensure that these things are being utilized very well, and how these things are going to be achieved? They don't show you the clear diversity or the clear ideology to how this interconnect. If you do not still buy into this argument, my member already shows you three things that primarily exist within this debate. One, the fact that most of the countries in the world do not have the economic resources to carry out this level of engineering. That becomes a particular world where you actually create an ecosystem where individuals are only going to engage, or individuals are only going to invest in countries that has the highest level of climate response to the issues. Why is this very bad, and why is this difficult? We understand that when COVID-19 came about, panel, before COVID-19 vaccine got to Africa, countries like China, countries like Europe and America are already accessing those vaccines. Africa and all other third world countries of the world got these vaccines at a very late hour. This primarily shows you the eco dynamic that exists when it comes to global politics, that has to do with prospect, and that has to do with the importance of things that guarantees human existence and makes life better. And all other third world countries are going to be the last to get this kind of access. At that particular point, you dislegitimize the activities of these countries, distribution of goods, because people largely are not going to invest in their world because they feel, one, they do not have that kind of traction to attract good environment. Secondly, these countries do not have the good economic know-how for them to survive when it comes to climate change. And there is no need to also encourage such disparity when it comes to issue of climate change. Third level of principle and extension from my side in what my member already, in what leader of opposition already tells you. From my side, I tell you, one, you need to consider the fact that there is already geographical differences that exist when it comes to climate changes. That it is like climate issues and climate engineering may work reasonably well when it comes to Africa, when it comes to America, in UK, and the rest of them. But when it comes to Africa, due to the difference in topographical system, there are every tendencies that, one, the level of climate engineering that is going to be engaged in Africa is likely going to affect the livelihood of Africans. Take, for example, if you decide to spray the air because you want to reduce mosquito, there's tendencies that at the end of the day, these are going to cause more hazardic effects on other human beings living within Africa. Opening government do not tell you, one, how they're going to mitigate against this harmful effect that is going to affect other countries of the world that do not have the topographical system with all of these other countries. It is good to go carry out this kind of research, and it is good to carry out this kind of engineering, but you must consider, one, who are the end points of those things? How is this thing going to affect these individuals? How are they going to ensure that at the end of the day, they do not get disenfranchised from accessing the basic things that they need within their community? Second level of analysis to this is to tell you, at a particular point when you decide to acidically flood waters, there are tendencies that when you bring this to Africa and all other countries, will likely depend on the wildlife that exists in sea, like fishes and all of those things. You are likely going to make those seas not to survive. This therefore directly hampers and affects the economic sustenance of this developing country. We need to consider the fact that, one, majority of the developing countries are farmers, and all of them rely on the wildlife existence of their economy. At a point where you carry out this climate engineering, you are likely going to cause three things. One, you affect their productivity level. Secondly, you make life very difficult for them, and more importantly, you disenfranchise them from having access to all other forms of good things of life, because individuals are going to backlash on them. OG, shoot your POI.
Technology is likely to trickle down to the third world because of my preemption, but also because developed countries have an incentive to do so because of the global supply chain. This is much better than your comparative, where nothing happens in the first place.
It's over 15 seconds. The only problem I have with this assumption is that you do not directly show how this technology is going to trickle down to these countries. Because it is one thing to say Africa is going to have this access to these technologies, but you do not show how they are going to have that particular access. When at the end of the day, the goal is for us to create an imaginary or a better environment. Why is this flawed? One, at a particular point where the capitalistic individuals within the world are the ones that are going to sponsor you. What they will do is that they will rather fund their money or send their money to countries where they know that they have the resources to carry out with this thing. It is not just enough to send these technologies to Africa. You need a lot of resources that is going to ensure its sustainability. And we know that America, UK, and all other good developed countries in the world already have this access. What you do is that you promise or you make a world where capitalists are not going to even send these machines to Africa because they want countries where they are likely going to be able to assess the availability of what they are going to enjoy at the end of the day. You make this very, very difficult for countries within these third world countries to grow, and you make their economic to suffer because they wouldn't have any form of investment due to bad economy and due to bad climate. We tell you, in a world where we support climate change, we'll accept the general terms of what the climate environmental movement is doing today, support the climate change according to the topographical of every countries, and make them develop themselves, and they have access to solving this problem towards the way that is going to help them grow economically, become economically thriving without any form of bias or any form of this disenfranchisation from having other access of the things that better the life. We proudly win from opening opposition.
Thank you for this fine speech. We conclude the top half. Let's move on to the bottom half of the debate. Member of government, whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Just 1 minute. I'll take POIs in the chat. 5th minute. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Panel, everything we get from OO is completely semantic to the core of this debate. We think that OO, the entire argument is based on a premise that has no significance and is not largely important in this debate. What we get from OO is simple, that because there is no universality and because these technologies will be largely concentrated in developing countries, the countries in the developing world will get to fail because they won't have access to these technologies, and therefore it's not justified to get these technologies from them. 4 kinds of responses that we give them on this front. 1, we think that climate change mitigation in one place is a benefit to climate change mitigation in all places. There's a certain universality of the damages that occurs when we all suffer the consequences of climate change, yet we are not all responsible for it. With this in regard, we think that when you mitigate climate change in a place as far as India, you're still mitigating climate change in a place as far as South America, despite the fact that there are hundreds of kilometers apart. We think that it is not justified for OO to argue that because the technology will only be concentrated in one place of the country, of the world, that means the other part of the world will suffer as a result. We think that this is largely uncomparative and it's not really the crux of the issue in this debate. Secondly, we also tell them that the issue of class disparities between developing countries and developed nations is unimportant in this debate, simply because environmental movement will do anything possible to ensure that they safeguard against environmental damage, regardless of how this affects, regardless of the process that takes us there. We think it's perfectly justified for environmental movements to use any means possible to ensure that they limit the damage to the climate change. But thirdly, panel, we think that when the hierarchy of priorities here is considered, we don't think that the priority for the environmental movement should be to gauge or to look at the scale of how developed or developing countries are not benefiting from something, but rather to look at how the whole world will benefit as a result of climate mitigation and so forth and so on. Fourthly, panel, as we've already had, we think that even in the best case scenario that OO are trying to paint for us, we still think that the technology will flow down to other countries, as we saw in the mid noughties. The Western European nations were the first ones to start to have the daily use of electric cars, such as Norway and Sweden, and now it's quickly trickling down to other places in the world, such as South America and the United States. But panel, another point of rebuttal is on the ethical conditions that the ethical considerations that OO attempted to paint for us here. We think that a precondition for any ethical condition to be considered, for any ethical consideration to be considered, is that you have to be alive. With that regard, we posit to you that with the climate change deterioration that is happening in the world today, we think people are going to have. We think more and more people are going to lose their lives, and therefore, when you're dead, you cannot make any more ethical considerations in this regard. With this in mind, I think the better regard for us when it comes to ethical considerations is to consider that our aim goal here is to ensure that we preserve the lives of these people, rather than worry about how wealthy or how less wealthy these people are, how much they'll have access to technologies and whatnot and whatnot. 3 things you're going to get exclusively from my speech. 1, why it's a perfectly legitimate means to use to achieve climate change mitigation. But secondly, why it's better for the environmental movement as a social justice movement. Thirdly, why all alternatives leave us worse off. firstly, why is it perfectly legitimate means to be used to combat global warming? We think that number one, we have an obligation to future generations, and these climate change movements have an obligation to future generations. We think that because of this obligation that they have to future generations, they have a mandate to ensure that climate change is fixed quickly, to ensure that these future generations do not suffer and live in a worse world than we have lived in, or in a world that is worse than our grandparents lived in. With this in regard, secondly, panel, we also think that there is a moral obligation to ensure that we have some form of reciprocity to the universe, given that we've benefited from being in the universe and living in the universe. And living in the universe and the world, and benefiting from the resources that the universe has given us. With this regard, I think we have a moral obligation to ensure that the future generations that come after us also get to benefit from the gift that the universe has given, the natural gift that the universe has given us in terms of resources and everything we've benefited from that. But the second reason why this is a perfectly legitimate means to achieve in combating in combating climate change is that there's a certain urgency that exists to the nature of the problem. We think that the problem is that we should fix the roof while the sun is shining and not wait while time is continuing to run away. And we think that this response in terms of urgency is perfectly proportional to the crisis, meaning that one, the damage that is being caused by climate change is untold and it's hurting millions of lives. But secondly, the harms of climate change are largely irreversible and the harms are impossible to mitigate. Okay. Okay.
So, can I shoot?
Yeah.
If I'm able to give you like an existent alternative that you can adopt and get all of your impact co-op to your benefits, do you think we win?
That's largely unimportant in this debate. But thirdly, panel, we're going to consider why it's better for the environmental movement as a social justice movement. Recognize, panel, that the environmental movements are largely seen as people who are just idealistic and they don't have any practical outcomes towards their activism. We think that these people who are largely seen as largely idealistic, like the Greenpeace movement or Insulate Britain and these likes of activists, will require to use some form of mechanism to ensure that they're seen as a tangible and a serious environmental movement. We think that the use of these measures, will ensure that they're seen as a tangible movement in society, and we think that's important because of one key thing here. Number one, it ensures that they have some form of ideological purity inside the movement, because they'll be able to get some buy-in towards people that are against the environmental movement, because now the people who are against the environmental movement will now start to take them more seriously, because they are adopting more serious measures that are ensuring that they go on towards mitigating global warming and climate change. Panel, thirdly and lastly, why we think the alternatives in this world have failed. We think that the alternatives have failed, and even when they've not failed, they are not moving fast enough to target the urgent issue that we face in this world. We think that this is caused by the lobbying by the corporations and the politicians who are vastly against climate change, and because of this, it leads to a large bureaucracy where it slows down the progress of ensuring that we mitigate the climate and we ensure that we have fast enough movement towards a world free of global warming. We think that all possible alternatives suffer this fate, and that a world where climate engineering is used will not suffer this fate, because climate engineering has the power to fundamentally alter the makeup of the environment and to ensure that the climate is fixed fast enough.
Thank you for this fine speech. Let's move on to closing opposition. Member opposition, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Can I be heard?
Yes, you can.
Fantastic. Please hear him pronounce POIs in chat. I'd like to take OG, but just please don't spam the text space so I can see the time. I would really take a point, honestly. So please don't spam. Just 1 sec so I can start. Okay, I'm going to start the speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm just going to do something simple here. I'm going to engage what the alternative looks like on our side of the house, why that alternative is going to be effective. But then, even if it's not going to be effective, I'm going to show you why their side also collapsed into the same problem that you already have under the status quo. And then the most important thing is the principled obligation that the environmental movements do owe in the way they exist. But notice that this principle justification is different from all of the stuff that we've been hearing from everything in the debate in terms of principle justification, because all of their principles do collapse into utilitarianism, like saving future generations, etc. It's not really a principle. It's like just collapse into like all of the kind of utilities that they want to stand for. I think opening opposition and their argument do ignore a lot of the stuff that's framed out by OG. I'm really going to engage with OG's framework and then prove to you why we are better off under the status quo, and like why we're going to amplify the benefits that exist in a counterfactual. First thing to note here is that there's a contradiction in the opening government mechanism and how they claim the status quo exists, which means that they claim that there's some certain level of like political clout that exists for green movements and etc. They have some certain level of financial resources, but also go on to claim that they are like maybe dispossessed by individuals who hold a lot of capitalistic resources within that same society. I think I really agree with the method that they used to prove their impact, which is one, that green parties under the status quo are now increasingly stronger, but also there's a lot of money that's associated under the green peace movement, etc., etc. Notice that their size significantly weakens this, and I'll analyze this to you in my extension. Why then is this frame important? The existent alternatives under the status quo, including emerging green technologies and businesses that are already applying to transition. The importance here is that all of the kind of subsidies that they want to use in for like climate engineering can also be channeled into things like green technology and increasing patterns to increase access for all of these things that they talk about, which means that these benefits are not exclusive. But note here the difference between our world and their world. Their model sustains the business models, their side sustains the business models of individuals who continue to plunder the environment, because for the fact that you have those existing structures and the reasons for why those individuals are able to profit here still in place, it means that they are going to be able to profit more. The impacts that you're able to generate out of this, that they're able to outcompete other green businesses that currently exist under the status quo and weaken the funds, the sources of revenue that are able to get to do all of these subsidies that currently exist on the other side of the house. We think this competition is kind of bad. Notice that the way in here is that benefits are inexclusive, but also given that climate change impacts at the point of no return, their survival policies are still no more better and are still harder to find. What then is the principled obligation that the environmental movement do owe? This is the first part of my extension. Note that one, they owe like that sense of like climate justice that they ought to fulfill. This includes like redress on past harms, so individuals ought to feel the impact of the harms that they have created on the environment, either by being directly responsible or by being complicit in that particular harm. So even if individuals are hard hit by the effect of climate change, that's essentially part of climate justice. So individuals can be able to feel that effect and know they ought to do better. But notice here that you don't have to benefit individuals who have harmed the environment. And that's what their model creates, because you sustain the business model that means that individuals are still encouraged to do things like more carbon emissions because those infrastructures continue to be in place. You don't encourage the transition. On their side, you currently benefit the individuals who are capitalists and they're able to, like, even though they do not participate in all of these forms of encouragement of these kind of business models, they're still able to profit here of it. I think this is crucially damaging to the movement. The next thing here is in terms of individual responsibility, because notice that we're able to do this better on our side. This is one of the principles of the the climate justice movement at the end of the environmental movement. You're able to change the practices of individuals by showing that their practices are harmful and impactful to the environment, are also damaging. But secondly, you're able to give them alternative sources of demand that exist under our side and other our alternative. But also note that you're able to change the business model and business approach of individuals. Their side does not create this kind of incentive, which is why it's damaging also to the environment. It means that you're not able to create redress, but also you're not able to secure individual responsibility for the kind of harms that are being created under the status quo, which means that their model is still unsustainable at best in curbing all of the effects or harms of climate change. What then are the over effects? Putting things here. One, notice that individuals on their own side, when you do not have culpability, creates more harms. When you do not feel that you're like the kind of harms that you create on the environment is something that is going to be so impactful, and you feel that the environment can be regenerated and all of the harms that you all of the ways in which you survive can still continue to thrive, can still continue to be sustained. It means that you have less incentive to change from all of those bad practices, which means that individuals continue to harm the environment more, and it takes time for even all of these climate engineering procedures to take effect, because the demand into all of those procedures continues to amplify on their side of the house because you do not eliminate it. It means that it takes a lot of time, a lot of resources that you have to expend for this to be effective on their side of the house. But notice that regeneration is difficult because you legitimize all of those practices and businesses are still able to continue with that particular model. But also notice that because of the lack of individual accountability, it means that you are unable to educate individuals or like give that form of awareness to individuals as opposed to what they ought to do, because you currently legitimize those practices that are harmful under the status quo. And it also notice that this is crucially damaging for animals who, because of the fact that individuals do not feel individual accountability for their actions, are able to engage in direct harms for other species that exist in the environment because of the facade of of regeneration that is likely to exist on the side of the house, and maybe you can get animal clones in the future. Why then does this reduce the power of the movement? This is the most important part of the extension that we give to you, aside from aside from the principled stuff that we already engage. Notice then that capitalists who make money from carbon businesses continue to benefit on their side of the house. But not that they don't just benefit alone, they benefit at the detriment of green businesses. Because for the fact that the green businesses on their side of the house lose buy-in because there's less demand for all of these things, given that individuals whose business model rely on climate regeneration are still able to sustain their business model, it means that green businesses lose money and lose out of competition within that space. It means that to a certain extent, all of these capitalists are not going to be pulling funds into the environmental movements at the end of the day. They don't have any incentive to it. It's only green businesses who are able to do this. On their own side, you reduce the economic capital of these movements at the end of the day. We think this is crucially damaging towards the movement. Before I talk about the second impact of this, opening of growth.
Yeah, while you're talking about individual responsibility, it is not scripted, but rather it already exists. We are trying to adopt something which is literally environmental friendly, but also boxes in all the benefits that will be accrued from generation to generation.
Yeah, all the time. Thank you. I did get that. So I think notice that my model, I explained to you why it's not just for the fact that individuals, all of these things already exist under the status quo, but you creating climate engineering absorbs individuals of all of the things like individual responsibility, absorbs individuals of things like transitioning towards green businesses because there's no demand for it under climate engineering at the end of the day. So it's not like all those things already exist in the status quo. You discourage those things on your side of the house by the existence of climate engineering, which makes those things ineffective. If you believe that those things are impactful or beneficial, then you discourage it on your side of the house, which is what my extension does prove. Why then does the demand increase for harmful products on the increase in demand for harmful products on their side of the house? Why is it extremely bad? Notice that this weakens the power of the movement because the ability for you to be able to create regulations depend on individuals realizing that these things are bad and lobbying against it. On their own side, there's no amount of lobbying against it because you can't regenerate the environment on their side of the house and you can't continue all of these practices. But notice that you reduce green alternatives, which means that you reduce the economic capital for this environmental movement on your side of the house. But notice lastly that you reduce sustainability of climate engineering because for the fact that you're not able to get things like funding, it means that you're not able to do subsidies in the future and subsidize other countries, and this is why we prove opening opposition's impact, but also extending into future generations and why you're able to cater for them, something you're not able to get on their side if you don't have access to funding. For all of these reasons, we're incredibly happy to oppose this motion.
Thank you for this fine speech. Let's move on back to the last speech of the government bench. Government Whip, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Just a minute to organize my notes. Okay. I will, sorry. I will type your eyes in the chat, but in case I don't see, just to voice it out, just say POI once, don't baja. Can I confirm that I'm audible?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So panel, first thing I'm going to do is engage CO. And then because my member largely engaged OO, and then I'm going to show you why we rank over OG, right? So first of all, the biggest CO's case is that if we encourage this kind of climate, if we encourage this kind of climate engineering, then we are out competing green businesses, and this will be harmful to us as, an environmental movement. So first of all, on the principal obligation and the layers that our member of opposition came and told us. So first of all, between redressing past harms and, trying to mitigate the effects that are already here, we believe that trying to mitigate the effects is far more important than trying to, redress past harms in the form of trying to punish and finding retribution for, the harms that have already been done. So essentially here we do not just as I've said, we believe it is more important for us to look to the future and try to actually mitigate the harms that are already here. As my member told you, we have a moral duty to ourselves and to future generations to, do this. Yeah. So, CEO tell you that we need to, that if we outcompete green businesses and we put them out of, if they lose their business, then they lose money and they lose capital. We are getting less buy-in for environmental movements. First of all, we do not see why the business aspect of this debate is affecting us as an environmental movement, because the goal of an environmental movement is to try and mitigate the effects of climate change that are going on. So we look at the best way possible. And CO told us they were going to give us an alternative for climate engineering, which they did not do. So we assume they're defending status quo. So panel chair, I would like to ask you a question. Between status quo, which is doing very little, basically doing nothing, or if it's doing anything, it's doing very little, and struggling to do something, even if just anything, to try and mitigate these factors as best as we could, we believe we would choose to try and do something. And because they have not told us that the climate engineering will not actually mitigate the effects of climate change, which is the number one goal of environmental movements. All the other things that opposition are coming to tell you here come second to the primary goal, which is to mitigate the effects of climate change. So if we do that, we believe we win this debate, because that is the primary goal and that should be our focus. The issue of businesses and green businesses, we believe that all this goes into the same cause. Whether we are outcompeting them or not, we are outcompeting them for the same cause, so we are still achieving our goal. So we believe we still win that clash. We do not believe that it is true that if green businesses lose their traction or their money, then we are going to get less donations, because mostly it is not them that are our largest donors, even if we were to rely on donations to actually help us push our goals. Yeah. So even the issue that they're bringing about of green alternatives, we believe that we are outcompeting green alternatives for the same purpose. So we believe that we still win that. I'm going to do an even if, just to buttress the point that my member told you. So opposition had an issue, opening opposition in this case. They said that environmental movements have a duty to propagate inclusion, advocacy, and equality of all countries. Just as I've told you, we do not believe that this is the primary goal of environmental movements, and we believe that as long as we are achieving the primary goal of environmental movements, then we should win this debate. We tell you that we believe that even if first of all, these rich countries that OO claims will have access to these resources are still probably the largest emitters of carbon, the largest burners of fossil fuels. So if they have the access to these resources and they use this, we believe that this is actually a plus on our side, because first of all, they are the largest emitters, so they are actually exercising their moral obligation to try and mitigate the effect that they created. So we believe that that is actually a good thing. And if they have access to that resources and they use that, we believe that they will have a ripple effect, because the mitigation will happen globally, just as the effects are being felt, globally. So we believe that even if that is an issue, and even if we have an issue with the classist disparity, it still goes to solve our main problem and our main issue. POI from CO.
Yeah, given that to a large extent, we already prove why your side weakens the environmental movement and the ability to be able to regulate carbon and carbon businesses. But furthermore, reduces our access to the alternatives that shift the scope or shift the dynamic on environmental impact. Do you still think that you're winning this debate?
First of all, we do not believe that we don't believe that we are reducing the amount of power that environmental movements will have to set policies and doing this, because as I've told you, on top of what is being done, more can be done. And if we are doing anything to achieve the goal of environmental movements, then we are still achieving the goal. Secondly, you have said that you're reducing the amount of power that environment. I've shown you how it is still going towards the same cause. So we still believe that if we are achieving the primary goal of these environmental movements, then all other things are trade-offs that we are willing to make because the goal is still being achieved. So harms the benefits. We believe that on top of what is being done, because the alternative is largely status quo, which is doing nothing or doing very little, on top of what is being done, if we can do more, then we are meeting the necessity and we are achieving our goal. Therefore, we win this debate. How do we differentiate ourselves from OG? A minute. We differentiate ourselves from OG because we have shown you why it is legitimate for us to take such great measures to achieve this, the goal of environmental movements, because we have an obligation to future generation, a moral obligation to future generations and to ourselves. We have shown you the urgency and the nature of the problem and why it is proportional to take such great measures, because anything under that is too slow or is not working. So essentially, we are harming, we are risking extincting humanity, which we of course all know. We have shown you why environmental movements as a social justice movement will be able to get more buy-in, and the practicability of this idea that even if CO try to tell you that, you know, environmental movements are losing their power and whatnot, we have still shown you why as a social justice movement we're able to get more buy-in because we are taking practical steps to, you know,
I'm sorry, your time has
combat.
ended. Sorry to interrupt you. It has been way over 7:15.
Sorry,
Thank you
okay.
for your speech. So thank you for this fine speech that concluded the government bench. Let's move on to the last speech of this debate. Here for opposition whip.
Hi, I want to confirm if I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Alright, that's cool. Okay, so hi, my name is Henry. POI is in the chat. If there is any unnecessary background noise that comes up, sorry, this is the best place that I can do. Yeah, for gender pronouns, he, him, she, they, whatever you wanna call me. So I'll start in I hope the time is ready. So I'll start in 3, 2, 1, go. See, we already told you, Chair, that like on the first go, like on the get-go, my member tells you about how very unrealistic government case comes into play. This is like the basic quotation that you get from all sides. Would want to fight climate change and want to have a more sustainable path to have a better climate change. But at a point where OG and CG, I repeat, I'm so tired of hearing this argument called urgency. At a point where they come and tell you that they're going to argue for urgency, we don't think urgency is going to catch it in the debate for two basic reasons. One, when you solve the problem and it is going to only be sustainable for 2, 3, 4, 5 days, that doesn't work. But then secondly, at a point where not everybody is going to get it, and you think everybody is going to get it on a point of urgency, when they don't have resources and don't have people to help them, then that's not going to catch it also in the debate as well. We think you can't just cut the debate and win this debate with urgency. I'm going to do two things in my speech. One, I'm going to clash both benches for you. And two, best case scenario. That's if I have time. So let's start with the first thing. Generally, what happens with, I'm going to start with OG. So what OG brings to you is something very simple. But I'm going to first like integrate their framing and like first take it down a bit because they really spoil the debate from the beginning. When they tell you about something about they believe that this is not reparation or they're not repairing the environment. There is something very simple about increasing algae in the sea using iron. All that is called reparation to the environment. When you plant trees in another place and from a place where they never existed, you are repairing the environment because you're putting back a number of trees that wasn't there. That's framing anyway. But you took them at their best framing, and this is came from member speech. Let's take them at their best. There are very few strategic problems with their speech. One, there is no mechanism on a mechanization on impact that happened with the best thing. what happens then from OG world, especially from PM, that they don't run along more on the impacts that generally happen. They just say their benefits. They don't break down the impact, how they trickle down to society, and how that creates better sustainability. The mechanism was mechanization was highly lacking in the round. We thought that was very bad and should really be addressed, and I should really bring it forward to the judge. So secondly, the other problem that we had, because they never had any impact, they also forgot to give us a trade-off analysis, cost-benefit analysis, and that's something that you get exclusively from closing opposition, especially from member of opposition. We tell you generally about how, even though in the best case world we want to think that your case is actually good, you don't give us the benefits or how your benefits outweigh the costs that we tell you. But then most importantly, they deliberately refuse to move on these particular things. But then agency. Then also they forgot to give us a trade-off analysis on the sort of point of urgency, of which this agency, when does this agency have to weigh up more the different levels of analysis that Ayodele, that Samuel runs to you in his member of opposition speech. We don't think that then OG can't sit in the debate to win it. We don't think they do enough to win it in the debate, because they run about the debate, and this was a very big problem in the opening clash, just telling us about how it is going to be affordable and accessible. We don't think that the debate was supposed to be centered on that. The crux of the debate was never about if it's accessible, if it can be accessible and attainable. The crux of the debate then gets in from member of opposition speech, particularly. But then I'm going to run a bit. Let's first move about and see what CG brought to offer. CG still brought about the whole idea of urgency. I've already addressed this by already telling you about how short-lived urgency does not make any sort of utility in the debate. Because if you want to fight climate change, there is no use for you to actually implement a policy to repair climate change for generations of people who are going to come and ruin that environment because they did not experience what we already told you in our speech, which is climate justice. If I experience climate justice, I can trickle down and tell it to my son. My son would have and would learn from the experiences that happened because of climate justice. Then my son will probably have a better way of carrying himself or in dealing with climate change issues. If I just solve the problem, I do not then create a world for him to be able to actually curb these problems or to be able to look after climate change. Good, fine, and all is well. You have brought that trees and the climate is reducing. What then? And you don't get any analysis whatsoever from any of OG or CG. Or at any point, if you actually implement this, are the future generations then going to utilize the environment, or they are going to wreck it and spoil it and cut down these trees like we all did in the first place? There is no difference whatsoever. Therefore, this does not become an exclusive argument. You're just going to have history repeating itself. We can't have that particular world implemented whatsoever. Then lastly, they tell you about the whole idea of buy-in, and like DPM tries to run a bit about how there's going to be buy-in and how people want to buy public image. This was mainly from closing government. We don't think that generally because there is a buy-in for people, like you said when there's buy-in for people are going to take Africa seriously and all these things. We already tell you that because these things are resources are very hard to come by, and it takes a lot of time to have green technology, these people will never have accessibility to these things. What then means is that then you never have people taking this seriously because you cannot actually do these things in the first place. But then secondly, because there's no unsustainable sort of like working on climate change, you'll never get a buy-in because no one is going to buy into something that is going to last for 6-5 months whatsoever. We're giving you a policy and we tell you that you cannot do this particular sort of thing because we tell you that there is the first step has not been achieved. The process, climate justice, the process then does not then work in that particular regard. Generally, that's what we want to tell you. So the problem and the genericity and the takeaway from OG and CG is that their policy works only in the short run. We can't credit such an argument. We cannot then fight sustainable climate change for future generations. If you're going to run something on the short run, OG go.
Yeah, this kind of climate engineering does really have the capability to implement green technology as well. If you have read the info slide, but rather we have already proven why exactly it is sustainable, and it will obviously bear fruit in generations to come. And you don't really get it.
Yeah, I get it. The only thing they justified you to tell you about sustainability, the technology can't keep on growing. But it's already shuttered out by the fact that we already tell you that this technology is already easy. The motion fiatly can only fiat to tell you that there is accessibility to this, that is, so they are available on the market. But you don't respond to the whole idea of capitalistic ideologies of people confiscating these things on the market and sell them at high prices to generate more money. No responses to that. That means that you don't get any sort of accessibility to that. But now take it at best. What do you get from my member? My member tells you about how business models and capitalist people then take the stage and confiscate these things and manipulate them in whatever way they want. That means that the actual players who are supposed to ensure for sustainability community, who are the people that are adjusting to greenhouse or using natural gas, are going to be locked out because the capitalists are only doing it for clout and to brainwash people into thinking that they're actually doing that particular thing. Your model then doesn't solve that problem because they're leaving it in the hands of the people who want to degrade the environment. Because these people are going to keep on degrading that environment. When they keep on degrading the environment, you then don't get any sustainability or progressivity, because if I cut down 50 trees and I plant 50 trees elsewhere, there's no progressivity and no fight for climate change. You don't reduce climate change. You're only just leaving things on a stalemate. And that is OG and CG world altogether. But then what do we tell you about? We tell you about climate justice. We tell you how people have responsibility. Someone runs a whole level, 2 levels of analysis as to why there is no responsibility on that end. We tell you about culpability and more harms. But best case scenario, all these guys are correct. Should we then say that we should not have any climate justice for people who have been affected or anything? Should we then do anything about it? I think we should do something about it, because we tell you about awareness. I think we learned so many things in the debate. We can't credit a debate that is short run and only bases on pragmatics. It just can't cut it.
Thank you for this fine speech. This concludes the debate as a whole. This round is a closed round from what they said in the chat, so I will not be returning to you for all our education, and you cannot get the result. But you will see the result, I guess, once the break is announced, or like after the tournament. You can reach out to me after they announce the break, because then I can tell you everything, I guess, and give you feedback if you need it. But before that, I assume I'm not allowed to do that. This was a great round, everyone, and good luck in the other rounds. You're all amazing. Thank you for the round.
Hello, Chair, are you here?
Yes?
I think this was the round 4, right?
Yes, they said it's closed in the chat like 10 times now. I can check again, but
Yeah, I think the round 5 was closed, not 4.
I am
I think-
rechecking. But I am very certain that it was also round 4.
Yeah, please do confirm.
Just give me a second, because people text a lot in those chats.